of these new evidences, now it is easy to decide what is to be done. So surgical valve durability is considered to be 11 to 14 years. We can only prove till now up to the 7 to 8 years of durability with TAVR valve. So that was considered in this new guidelines. The other important issue is about when you are doing it. So if you are doing it very early, then he may require second or third or fourth procedure in his life, because if his life expectancy is more than 20 years, and they say now that the surgical procedure is preferred, and then you can do a valve in valve in this procedure. So he just have to go for one surgery, and then afterwards TAVR can be done. So if we go for TAVR first, that will be a problem. So this is the new guideline which says that how to decide about TAVR versus SAVR. So first thing is about, first patient should be symptomatic. If he is indicated for surgery or AVR, then if the risk is very high or prohibitive, definitely there is no question of surgery. Either he should go for TAVR or he should go for palliative therapy. If the risk is intermediate or low, then definitely we should decide on multiple factors. If patient has a high VK risk or not. So if he can be given anticoagulation or not. If he can be given anticoagulation, then issue comes about the age. If age is less than 50 years, definitely mechanical valve or autograft of pulmonary valve is preferred. Between 50 to 65 years, generally mechanical valve is preferred. If there is some contraindication or patient doesn't want, then bioprosthetic valve can be given. So more than 65 years is the age when they say that bioprosthetic valve is the first indication. And if there is no VK, or the VK can't be given, then bioprosthetic valve is the only option. So now question comes that which patient should go for surgical versus TAVR bioprosthetic valve, because both are having bioprosthetic valves. So if patient is first is asymptomatic patients, second is very small annulus or very calcified alveoli, all the anatomical problems of the TAVR like heavy decided that patient should go for TAVR. The most important thing is excess. Most of the complications happening because of the excess. So excess, basically, it is very simple nowadays that if the size of the femoral artery is less than 5, it is not a very good case for TAVR. Either we have to go for an alternative access or we have to go for surgery. So in patients with borderline 4.5 to 5, there is totally no calcium and patient is comparatively younger without fibrosis, we can still try this with surgical exposure of that. TAVR can be done easily. 5 to 6 again is borderline. If there is circumferential calcium, either we have to first dilate it or we can choose, and then surgery is preferred over the TAVR. Medtronic has 2 valves, Evolute R and the advanced Evolute Pro. Vascular Concept has Hydra valve, which is also a self-expanding valve. So these are self-expanding valves. And then 2 balloon expandable valves, Edwards Sapien and the Mid-India valve, MyValve. So both have multiple sizes available, and only the Evolute valve is supraannular, all are annular valves. You can see the minimum access for Medtronic Evolute R is 5 to 6, which is the lowest. Others require at least 5.5 with the specific sheaths which can be dilated when the valve is pushed in. So we have to remember that also, that valve, once valve is going in, sheath has to be dilated. So that space should be there. The other important thing, as we are discussing about the anatomical, is that valve should be suitable for the patient anatomy. So we have to measure multiple dimensions in aortic valve to assess. The most important measurement is aortic annulus, which is to be measured and which decides that what size of the valve is required and which one will be more suitable. Along with this, we have to check for calcium, we have to check for coronary artery height, we have to check for sinus sizes. If sinuses are good, then we are not worried about coronary obstruction. So this will again be discussed by Dr. Sindhu. So along with once you decide that this much is the area of the annulus and this much is the perimeter of the annulus, then we decide which valve is suitable. So again, if there is a borderline issue that the penetrants are coming in the borderline way, generally we prefer the bigger valve, but now with MyValve there are intermediate sizes also available, so that gives you a more flexibility in selecting the right valve. So this is an important thing, that balloon expandable valves can be tailor-made by increasing the size of the balloon to 1 or 2 mm extra, and the Indian valve has the alternate sizes also available in the 0.5, 1.5 sizes, so you can choose them better. But it is very important to understand that more than 80% of the cases and all the kind of valves can be used and they are doing the job finely. Only in few patients you may have to choose between one and another. So I will give some of my thoughts, and they may be different from others. So this is one of the thought, that very small annulus, generally a supraannular valve is preferred. For a very small vessel size, definitely the TAVR is not a good option. For intermediate sizes, the lowest profile valve is Evolute R, which can be suitable for patient in which the size is less than 5.5. All other sizes, all are suitable. If there is very heavy calcium, we have to be cautious with all the valves because complications are high. If the coronary is also low, then we should be very cautious that patient can have problems.
Dr. Nagin Chauhan, can you please summarize? The time is little.
Yeah, just one slide more.
Yeah, please.
So with this, we can choose between these valves, and I will not go into details of all these things that we should be remembering our future chronic surge, PVL also. So these are 3 examples of 3 patients, low coronary score, high chance of annular rupture because of LVOT calcium. Patient was, after discussions, referred for surgery. Second patient, very high surgical risk, again very high risk of annular rupture, gone for a self-expanding valve because less risk of annular rupture. The third patient, again, because of high risk of annular rupture, referred for surgery. So even after deciding for TAVR, you can again rethink and send the patient for TAVR. So with this, I just want to conclude that always remember that your outcome should be better or as equal.
For all cardiologists is getting popular. Aortic stenosis with bicuspid aortic valves. The valves are absolutely deformed. So it has to be a collective diagnosis with presentation is much earlier. This slide only depicts this. Bicuspid aortic valves initially was excluded the bicuspid aortic valve, which proves the adequate safety of this procedure in bicuspid, and slowly the issues which were confronted initially, like prior to tricuspid aortic valve, because of the eccentric opening, it has a higher sealing zone. Obviously, the sealing zone becomes much higher as compared to the annular plane. The higher pacing rates probably. So initial studies also mention that pacing rates are higher, and the higher PVL rates. So these are some of the concerns while we deal with bicuspid aortic valves once planning a TAVR in such subsets. Recommendations for self-expanding valves: size appropriately based on a sealing zone, and a pre-balloon aortic valvotomy should be done in these patients. Shallow implant and slow deployment. This is the key to deal with TAVR in bicuspid aortic valve. This is a very, very important step. As I mentioned, as the data accumulated, we learned that if we deploy the valves at a shallow height, exactly at the annular plane, or 0 or even -1, 1 or 0, then the results and outcomes are better, and probably the pacing rates are also lower and the PVLs are also lower. And we should go very slow in these valves. And obviously we should anticipate, we should consider the post valve deployment aortic valvotomy with a bigger balloon if the gradients are more and moderate PVL. This, in any case, we follow this with all kinds of subsets. So issues learned from first generation bicuspid valves with TAVR, that CT is mandatory for sizing and diagnosis. Since it has a high PVL rates, 18 to 32% in initial studies, and high pacing rates, most studies are small and limited numbers. We require more randomized data in this aspect. So evaluation of TAVR in bicuspid patients with the Asian population. So this is another procedural success rate is almost equal. So there is no issue with procedural of bicuspid. This is extremely important stuff, and we all be flaring where it is a narrow funnel shape, where it is narrowed down and broader upwards, or it could taper like this, that it's broader at the annulus and narrow upwards. So we should actually know this, that where to take, what size of the valve to take according to these parameters. And recommendations for a bicuspid implant, there is another insight into the bicuspid aortic valve. Once we are measuring that it should be measured at 0, which is the annulus, 5 millimeter above the annulus, and 8 millimeter above the annulus for self-expanding valves. If the tubular, I showed you 3 configurations. If tubular, size based on the annulus and implant discussed. So case 1 and its bicuspid specific measurements. I think I'm short of time. I'll just run you through to the cases. 2 cases I have, both with one self-expanding and with one balloon expanding. So this is one case where we planned a self-expanding valve. Why I'm showing you, it's very important that how to deploy at what depth. So this is crossing the valve and valve check before pre-dilatation, routine steps. I'm not going into the detail. So this is the deployment. The valve has been crossed, which we are looking at for bicuspid valves because of the anatomy. Another case with the balloon expandable position almost, and then deployed at a rapid pacing. And this is the final result. So there is some residual, this thing is a heavily calcified valve. So there is some residual thing, but no BVLs and no significant gradients. So key takeaways, last slide. Currently no standard established guidelines for treating bicuspid. Clinical data shows no significant differences between total cause mortality, stroke, life-threatening bleeding, or major vascular complications between the
Kapoor. And going on to this, the season, I must say, the season of structural heart diseases. So I will not go too far away from, TAVI or from other structural interventions. Basically, left atrial appendage occlusion, as Dr. Mohit has given this topic, and it's now catching up. This technology is catching up everywhere in the world for indications which I'm going to discuss with you. So today I'm going to actually show you a case where a TAVI and LA closure was done together also in this presentation, because as I said that the flavor of today's session is TAVI, so I have to do something about that also. So let me start with the left atrial appendage occlusion. Thrombus in the left atrial appendage is one of the commonest cause of having stroke in atrial fibrillation.
Share the slide.
And this, can you hear? Is there a problem
but
here?
you don't have your slides.
share your slides.
Oh, sorry. Is it not shared?
Share screen.
Okay, sorry. Why it is not happening? Okay, escape. A minute.
It's still not there.
It's still not there? Okay. Why it is not happening?
You want to speak without that?
No. Okay. Is it coming now?
No, not yet.
Abhi aa gaya?
Yeah, now it's coming. Yes.
Okay.
So sorry.
You have to do a full screen now.
Okay, now is it better?
Perfect.
Okay, good. So basically left atrial appendage, as you can see here, this is the problem, that we have to stop all this thrombi, that this clot can go out anytime, and we have to stop it here. So what are the ways to do that? So basically we know that before we start that left atrial appendage is a vestigial organ. It is a gestational remnant. Trials have shown that there is reduction in incidence of stroke, reduction in incidence of all-cause mortality considered in patients who have high risk of stroke and who are contraindicated for long-term oral anticoagulation. So this is the recommendation, and which is the ACP device, or now the new model is the Amulet, and the second is the Watchman device, which has been also studied reasonably well in this arena of left atrial appendage occlusion. So you can see that once this device is implanted through a transseptal approach, what happens is that in about 30 days time, the endothelium starts growing, and in 45 days time, the complete coverage of this device happens. And in 9 months post-implantation, you can see that it is complete occlusion. You can see nothing, and it is completely excluded. So the evidence which has been accumulated on these devices are various, starting from 2002, which was the pilot study. Rate of ischemic stroke compared to warfarin was no difference, and the rate of hemorrhagic stroke of reduction of stroke. And about 30% patients are having atrial fibrillation at some point in time in those patients who are undergoing TAVR. So these patients have to be protected because they have chronic AFib or they develop new onset AFib. If you look at the Charles-Vaz score in TAVI patients, this is the Charles-Vaz score. And you can see that the Charles-Vaz score, congestive heart failure is almost 100% of this, this logic or this hypothesis. And you can see that this is a 76 years old female patient where it was done stenosis. Patient was in heart failure. You can look at this. The Charles-Vaz score was high. The Hasbled score was high. Charles-Vaz was 8 and Hasbled was 4. So this, you can see that the first procedure which was done was a TAVI procedure in this expanding valve, which was used in this case. And you can see amount of calcium here. And this is the, the implantation of the valve with positioning, and then gradual, release at the right position, checking in various views. And once this was done, we checked the echo, the chute. There was no AR. After the successful TAVR in this patient, we took this patient for a left atrial appendage occlusion. And you can see that the first thing in here is the T support. And this is very important, that the team must have a very good, understanding of the transverse atrial appendage occlusion and the size.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now it should
Hello?
be. Okay. Good,
Okay.
good.
Okay, fine. Okay, so here you can see that the first step is to put the sheath inside the left atrium. And once the sheath is inside, this is a 3 marker sheath, which gives the size of the device which we are going to use. We give put a pigtail into the distal edge most part of the left atrial appendage. And you can see that we can make out as to where we have to implant. And then finally, once this is done, we start releasing it inside, check it if everything is okay, if the position is fine. And once the position is fine, there is no leak, the shoulders are good, which we check on the T examination, which I'll show you quickly. Then we go ahead and implant this. So in this patient, we are trying to check it. There are 2 sizes which we selected. One was a 21 and 24. And here you can see that this is how we measure the left atrial appendage, the length, the depth, and the diameter of the device which we have. And this is the septal crossing. I mean, this is just to demonstrate that how we do it. And this is done again through a T guidance, because otherwise, if you don't do a good puncture at the good site, it is very difficult to go into the left atrial appendage. So the measurements are done online, and after that, we took this device. It was okay. Then we can release it inside. And once it is done, we have just removed the sheath very easily without a problem, and the patient can be discharged on the very next day. So it is just a 1-day device, 1-day procedure. So TAVR and LAO seems to be existing together. They are friends, and we have to treat both these problems. And these elderly patients do not tolerate OAC or NOx in these many situations. And our patient had severe bleeding with oral anticoagulation, and hence received a TAVR and LAO procedure together in the same hospitalization. However, of course, we understand that the limitation is the cost, but if cost is not an issue, certainly this is a fantastic thing to be done in these patients. So to conclude, thromboembolism in atrial fibrillation is a major cause of morbidity and mortality. There are many trials which have been done, robust clinical programs have been conducted and shown from these PROTECT AF, CAP, ASAP, and PREVAIL, given us very fruitful outcomes in many such patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Praveen. Very impressive. I think just a quick question, if we have time, regarding this. Number one is the cost. And secondly, how many cases you have done together, TAVI as well as LA closure? And thirdly, do you think that once you have done a LA occlusion, are you completely free that there is no need to give in a persisting AF condition any oral anticoagulants?
Okay, so the recommendation is to give 45 days of oral anticoagulation, and then these patients can just continue aspirin. But there are some patients who are absolutely intolerant to anticoagulation. In these patients, we give them dual antiplatelet for about 45 days and then stop the second antiplatelet and continue them on aspirin alone. So that is the follow-up regimen which we follow in these patients.
Any need for follow-up?
So Dr. Parveen,
yeah, Dr. Claire, please.
Dr. Claire, please.
Parveen, I just want to ask you that it's a fantastic left loop.
Hello.
I think there's some internet problem.
Dr. Claire's voice is not audible.
Oh yeah, I think he's left. He's not connected now.
Yeah, I can't see. Yeah, he's lost.
My question was, LA, do you think to repeat the TE and follow up in such cases once you've done a Watchman?
Yes. So there is a need to repeat the TE at about 6 weeks. We can repeat it, and then at about 6 months. Generally, that is the recommendation. And then if there is no leak, if the device is okay, there is no device-related thrombus, then we can stop. Don't give the second antiplatelet, just continue aspirin.
That
But
means
if
stop
there is a device-related thrombus,
oral anticoagulation to be stopped only once you have done a repeat TE.
repeat TE and device-related thrombus has to be excluded.
Very nice. I think it's you should be congratulated for such things which are very important for the patient's overall life survival and prevention of stroke and other things. I think the session is now over for this point of time. We don't have other two speakers, Simrik Velu and other speaker. Dr. Mohit, should we close the session now? Hello?
Yes, sir, we can close this session. Dr. R.D. Yadav will take care of the next session.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be associated with the team of Delhi CSI, and all the talks were very fruitful. Dr. Praveen Chandra, Dr. Nagendra Chauhan, and in between Dr. Rajnish Kapoor. So I am thankful to the speakers and also the organizer for giving the opportunity to chair this session. Thank you very much from Apollo Hospital, New Delhi.
Thank you.
Over to Dr. R.D. Yadav. Sir, you are on the mute.
RD is not visible.
Yes.
No, he is visible. He is visible.
Who is the speaker? Actually, I have no list of speakers, so anyone can continue.
So
Anyone?
I have.
Yes, sir.
So I have a session on chip, I think. So
Yes,
which
sir.
I can.
Continue with the chip, sir, because I have no list here, so I'm trying to get it. So you can, yeah, Dr. Praveen Chandra, sir. Now, how new devices and techniques can improve clinical outcome in high-risk PCI? Is it?
So yes, that is the presentation.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
ये डॉक्टर विजय त्रिहन सर का खुल गया है.
Sir, this session starts with Dr. Trehan's presentation only.
Okay, so let him start. Let him start.
Yeah. Dr. Vijay Trihan sir is the first speaker.
Please,
Now I got the list. I can continue with the list. The hidden tiger, defining a real definition of cheap patient and use of new modalities. 20 minutes, Dr. Vijay Trihan sir.
Yeah, first of all, my apologies because I thought that my session is tomorrow and only in the way. As I was coming from Katla, I received a call from Ravi that you have a session right now. So I just tried to mingle up with some of the slides when things are going on. And I thought I have Praveen who will be following me, will be easing my job. So the topic given to me is hidden tiger. Well, is it tiger? Well, yes, all of us know that it has a capability to take on the king of the jungle. So all of us know that chip patients are more or less like tigers. They behave like tigers with the patient because they can kill, and also they behave like tigers because they can hunt the hunter. So I think this name is appropriate. And is it hidden? I think it is hidden. If you try to have a look at it, you find it difficult to spot these cases. And let me just, for the sake of just for discussion, this is one tiger. Can you see the hidden tiger? Anybody? Dr. Praveen, can you see the hidden tiger? Dr. Yadav?
No, sir.
It is on the
You
slide.
can't see this.
I'm able to see the tiger, but not the hidden tiger.
No, we can.
So, but
Yeah, the slide
if you
is.
look at this is
Yes.
this is hidden and tiger. So often the problem is right in front of us and we are not looking for it. And nowadays what is happening, we have a lot of allegations that we are overusing. And this is despite Courage, Orbita and Ischemia trial, which say that, well, we are overusing our PCI techniques, which in fact to some extent is okay, but unfortunately we are the targets. Most ultrasounds, especially carotid ultrasounds, most, not majority is more than 50%. Most is like only 5.4% is appropriate. That means 94% are inappropriate. So nobody will say that you are overusing a carotid ultrasound. You have a huge list of other investigations like ECG, bone scan, and almost everything. But you are the target. You are taken up by the media and all others that you are overdoing. People are doing magnet therapy. Nobody will say that they are being overused. So we are nowadays amongst allegations of overuse and especially low risk patients, which I think to some extent is correct. But the matter of fact is that a large number of patients who have serious comorbidities and heart failure, they are not even investigated. Leave aside taking them up for a PCI or surgery. They are not even investigated. And here is a report from Darshan Doshi, that was about 4 years ago, where he looked at new onset heart failure, about more than 60,000 patients. What they found was that in the term of workup, which includes invasive and non-invasive, only 1/4 are worked up. Rest are not worked up. And that is within 3 months. Means they are admitted, during admission, very small people are worked up. And even after discharge, when people start looking better, even then most of the physicians will shy away from taking them up for investigations. Only 1/4 are taken up for investigations, which includes even non-invasive investigations within 3 months. So that is a sorry state of affair. And if you come to revascularization in the hospital and 3 months later, it is just a minuscule. It is just less than 5%. So I think we have a lot of hidden tigers, which we want to unearth and pay attention to and possibly serve. This is not only with HFrEF, this is even with HFpEF. Even if the LV ejection fraction is fine, if the patient is not failure, most of us will shy away from handling these cases. And if you come to ACS, and those with the highest GRACE score, they are not even taken up for an angiogram. Leave aside doing a PCI. So not only this, if you talk to our surgical colleagues, even they, if they find that the patients are having high risk, they won't address them. For some reason or the other, things will be postponed. And about 1/4 of the patients who are turned down, if they are taken up for some kind of revascularization, what we find is there is 6 times higher mortality. That is what is the biggest problem, because we know that if we handle these cases, the results may not be as good. And it is unfortunate that your results may be compared with the results of those which are relatively simpler cases and not sick. So there is treatment paradox. Gallstone analogy, somebody gallstone and expect who's ready with an endoscope to take the gallstone out. But the moment this gallstone starts making a problem in the form of biliary colic, cholecystitis, empyema, then sepsis, and then shock, then I think as the seriousness increases, most of us will withdraw our pseudopodia. We are not happy, or we are not inclined or interested in taking up these cases. And let me tell you, just handling a gallstone probably does not help the patient as much, especially asymptomatic gallstone patient, as will be a patient with an empyema and a sepsis. Because unless you remove gallbladder and take away the septic focus, your patient is unlikely to recover. But most of us, because we sense that such cases will have a high mortality, will be difficult to handle, they are usually not handled. And we are all happy to counsel the patient that if you have a gallstone over a period of time, you will develop cancer, so your gallstone should be out. So ultrasonologist sends the patient directly to the surgeon, and an endoscopic surgeon who is doing a lab chole is very happy to take these patients. However, the same patient, if he is down the line getting into serious problem, most of us will shy away from handling these cases. And if you look at a lot of people will say it is useless to handle them because you cannot improve the prognosis. But if you look at the paradigm heart failure, and you look at how many patients, what's the NNT to make one survive, and how many people you want to treat before you want to make one life survive, is like 18 with ACE inhibitor and 14 with ICD and CRT, and almost the same number in STITCH trial if you revascularize them. The analogy can be, if you are handling these cases, you just need a handful of these cases to handle to improve survival. So you don't need 400, 500 people to 500 people of shift cases to be done before you make one person survive. So the question, is it appropriate? Well, the answer is, as the symptoms get worse, as the more and more medications are required. As the stress test positivity is severe, and more severe is the anatomy, I think it is more and more appropriate. So to say that whether it is appropriate or not, I think you're totally away from allegations of overuse, because those will be there if you're handling just simple cases, not too much of inducible ischemia and not too much of symptoms. But vast majority of these patients are denied treatment despite the fact that they are deserving this. Now, let me give you an analogy with stroke. Somebody who has a chance to get into stroke, and we can assess who's going to have a chance to get into stroke, is by Chadwell score. And these are the, unfortunately, these are the only cases who also have a tendency to get into problems related with treatment in the form of oral anticoagulants. And if you look at the risk factors, those people who have a chance to get stroke, like those who are elderly, also have a chance to get into bleeding related to anticoagulation. Similarly, those who are hypertensive also have a chance to get into problem with anticoagulants. Similarly, if you've had a stroke, you have a chance to get into problem. So this is an unfortunate situation that those who require the treatment also unfortunately have a higher chance to get into trouble. So if you have an atrial fibrillation and a person is low risk or high risk, let's say low risk, you treat them with the anticoagulants, you prevent 4 thrombotic strokes and you buy 1 hemorrhagic stroke. Whereas if it is a high risk situation, you will prevent 40 thrombotic strokes and you will buy 10 hemorrhagic strokes. So there is a net benefit of 30. But the question is high risk. High risk to whom? One is high risk to the patient. Second is high risk to the reputation of the treating physician. Here, since the physician is scared because his reputation may be spoiled, because if you're treating low risk cases, then only 1 will get a hemorrhagic stroke. Where if he's handling high risk cases, 10 will get a hemorrhagic stroke. So despite the fact the benefit is tremendous in high risk population, most of us will choose to treat low risk population. And that is what is precisely happening with our interventional sphere in the coronary artery disease, that if the patient has a high risk anatomy, has a high risk physiology, has hemodynamic compromise, then most of us will shy away from handling these cases. And that is what is the hidden part about this tiger. So we have a lot of risk treatment paradox. And I think there's an urgent need to educate the community, because they should know that this kind of a patient, if they are being treated, then the statistics will not be as good as will be if you're handling low risk cases. And in fact, I am reminded of some time ago in New York State, when those people who were handled, who were having cardiogenic shock, if they were taken for primary PCI, obviously the mortality is high and the figures became bad. And it was mandatory on their part to put it on their board that how many cases on this operator, this hospital is doing and what's the mortality. So what happened is this primary PCI in cardiogenic shock totally disappeared from New York State. And it had to be sorted out by taking the statistics of primary PCI of the individuals and of the institutions out of their total statistics, just to encourage that the people can take up these patients of acute MI with cardiogenic shock for primary PCI, because their statistics are now no longer being shown everywhere. So I think we need to educate the community that this hidden problem can be unearthed, and if we are trying to handle them, the mortality will be higher than the people at large. But then, being a hidden tiger, it will attack you otherwise, and it is more likely or has a higher chance to take away your life. Of course, this you will require specialized centers, specialized or highly trained person who can do it. But the bottom line is, whatever we were thinking in the past that it is difficult to handle, if with the development of skill and with improvement of your gadgets in your center, if you're able to cater to these population, I think we are going to translate into tremendous benefit to the patient. So coming to the definition of CHIP, we all understand it's a complex high risk indicated patients, and complexities we know that it's because of various things, and high risk also we know because of the poor ejection fraction comorbidities and hemodynamic compromise. Let me just give you a flavor. This is a 77-year-old male who had a